Hi, I'm Ron and welcome to PopScicle, where I talk about popular culture, science, and everything in between. A few days ago, I was able to catch the first two episodes of the new Netflix documentary Alien Worlds, which is, of course, right up my alley, given that I teach a biology of science fiction course. And so I wasn't surprised that a lot of my friends messaged me right after it premiered on Netflix, the first four episodes, telling me that I should watch it and it's probably something that I should include in my biology of science fiction class, and I completely agree. In fact, I've already recommended it to my students as a supplementary viewing to some of our lessons. Here in this episode, I'm going to give my thoughts about the first two episodes that I was able to watch, particularly the ones entitled Atlas and Janus. While watching it, I had a running commentary, but I wasn't able to record an actual reaction video while I was watching the series. But instead, I'll just give my post-episode thoughts about it. Now, it's a fascinating documentary. I wish there were more episodes. I think 4 is much too few, or maybe Netflix is just testing it first and seeing if there's a lot of interest in it. And from what I've seen, there is quite a bit of interest in it, even for those who are not typically into science or science fiction. And the way it was done makes that understandable, given it's very accessible even to people who aren't really solidly into science fiction. And in fact, that's probably one of my greatest criticisms about it, which I've seen is a criticism that is shared by a lot of people online, particularly those that were looking for the same things that I was, maybe because they are as much of a sci-fi fan that as I am. And that is the fact that there's too much Earth-based stuff in the first two episodes and too little of the sci-fi, of the alien worlds, which should be the focus given the title. You know, it's perfectly understandable that they would be taking a lot of science from Earth science, from what we know of science as practiced and as seen on this planet, because it's our only basis, really, for how the universe works. And in fact, this is also my approach. I discuss the basic biology on Earth first, that has to do with the topic that I'm currently discussing, and then we go into sci-fi examples to flesh it out. And then later on, I add some extra information on biology specific to the source material. So I was fully expecting that they'd be doing the same for this series, because being a documentary, it can't be straight up alien worlds and none of Earth. Otherwise, that would be complete science fiction, not a documentary. However, I wanted there to be more alien worlds. For a series that's so titled, it has much too few scenes of the alien worlds, which makes for something that frustrates. That is kind of frustrating for science fiction fans. For example, I saw a comment on a Facebook group that I'm a part of, where someone posted about alien worlds, and one of the members of that group said, I came to watch something like this. I'm paraphrasing, of course. I came to watch aliens and alien worlds. I didn't come here to watch a guy paragliding. And that was in the first episode, Atlas episode. And so I understand. It was frustrating. The second episode had more alien life in it, had more biology in it that was based outside the Earth, that was speculative, which is what I was looking for. So hopefully, the third and the fourth will have even more. It's pretty understandable that they have more Earth biology in the first episode because they were setting it up. And in fact, the first few parts of that episode were really about setting up the idea that there could be life out there, given that there are so many exoplanets, so many planets outside our solar system, outside our galaxy. Then the chances of there being life, no matter how simple, no matter how basic, are astronomical, essentially. And that's what the episode started with. That's what the whole series started with. And again, that's pretty understandable. But then when you have to cut back to so many different scenes in Earth science that are not really even very biological. For example, that whole paraglider stuff was admittedly very boring. They just put it in there to explain that that moving through air, while paragliding, there's lift provided by the air that keeps you up. And essentially, it was revolving around the idea that this fictional planet, Atlas, is a planet where the gravity is much higher than on Earth. But as a consequence of that, the atmosphere is much thicker. And so they go into this paragliding thing, which admittedly takes too long just to say things about lift. When I believe it was unnecessarily long, and there were too many scenes going back to Earth science that could have been explained in a much more streamlined or shorthand matter. Because, you know, if I wanted to see a lot of Earth science, I'd watch a lot of Discovery Channel series that talk about Earth science. I want more alien science, with, of course, some explanation based on Earth science. Now, having said that, let's go into more details. The first episode, again, is Atlas, and it talks about a planet where gravity is much stronger, than on Earth. So you would think that most life wouldn't be able to go high up in the atmosphere. They'd be stuck on the ground because they're more massive. But it's very interesting that they did explain that because of the strong gravity, the atmosphere is much thicker and denser. So that was an interesting explanation, which is scientifically viable, which explains why there are flying creatures. The high or strong gravity explains why most of the land-bound creatures are boneless and very amorphous, and they look like shoggoths, actually rolling around on the ground like that. And a lot of anime fans would probably hate me for saying this, but they also reminded me of Mitty from Made in Abyss. I won't bother showing a graphic of that because it's too disturbing. Sorry to the Made in Abyss fans for reminding you about Mitty, but that scene of those Shoggoth-like land-bound creatures reminded me of Mitty. But anyway, that makes sense, and I would also expect that the skeletal system of the flyers, the sky grazers, if I'm not mistaken, that's what they're called, would also be made of their skeletal system would also be quite light, or should also be quite light. Otherwise, they would be too heavy, for their own weight to support them, or for their own strength to support them. And that has a lot to do with the fact that as the size of an organism grows, its mass grows by the cube of its linear increase, whereas its weight-bearing strength grows only by the square. However, the thick, dense atmosphere, by virtue of the strong gravity, explains why they are able to keep themselves aloft, and that makes sense. And when they introduce those bag-like, inflatable, insect-like predators of the sky grazers, I was wowed by that, by the design, because those were very interesting, particularly when they did that kamikaze bombing from above, which peregrine falcons and other birds of prey do excellently on Earth. Now, practically all of the biology there makes sense. There was just one particular aspect there that I had to question when I saw it, and it revolved around sexual selection. There was a part there where it was said that the male sky grazers have a large tail, an elongated tail with a sort of paddle at its end that females don't have. Does it make sense from a biological perspective? Definitely. In most animal species, it's the male that shows very distinct anatomical characteristics that would make it attractive to females and would give it an advantage over fellow males in the competition for females. Now, they said in the video that tail, even if it proves attractive to the female because it's an obvious sign of strength and health, and the reason for that was it's actually much harder for the male sky grazers with large tails to fly, to maneuver, to lift themselves up in the atmosphere of Atlas, and so it's a sign of strength. I get that. However, the same sequence in that video shows those male sky grazers with a bigger tail being able to outmaneuver and being able to get to the female before those with smaller tails could. And that ran counter to what the video had just said, which is that it is actually a disadvantage in terms of maneuvering in the sky. And so you would, aside from that, you would also have to question why a female would find that attractive, when in fact circumstances would normally, I mean, of course there are many other factors, but given what they said in the video and given the fact that they are always in the air and there are predators, right? Combine those two things. Large males with large tails are less able to fly and maneuver well compared to those with smaller tails. And so number one, they would be less likely to catch up to females. And number two, they would be more likely to be caught by predators. Now, you're probably thinking, well, the tail probably allows them to compete directly with males. It's intrasexual selection within the male sex because it gives them a physical advantage in another way over the male. I definitely agree, but the video never said that or never showed it. If the episode had shown that the male with the large tail is able to slap aside, physically push aside the males with the smaller tail, then it would be perfectly understandable why the females would find that attractive and why that trait would be passed from generation to generation. But that was never mentioned. And so it remains a mystery as to how, despite the disadvantages or the blatantly mentioned disadvantages of the males having a larger tail, they are still able to get to the female first and they're still able to pass on that gene for a large tail to the next generation. However, it must be mentioned that it's not a runaway selection, that there are still males with small tails, so there is some balancing effect, and that probably has to do with the fact that not all males with large tails will be able to catch up to the female. However, I still believe that there was that gap. I still believe it would have been better if there was a better explanation for why males with larger tails are more reproductively successful despite not being able to fly really well in the air, which is their domain. The only time that the sky grazer spends on land is when it's born, before it starts flying, and when a female lays its eggs on the ground, which actually stands to mean that the male, once it starts flying, never lands on the ground until it dies. So there's that gap, which I was hoping would be addressed. Now, episode 2 is much more interesting, again, because it spends more time on the alien world, namely the one named Janus, than on Earth. But also because Janus is a planet that revolves around a red star, a red dwarf star. And this is something that I've been discussing in my class. So I told my class, hey, watch this episode because it's a perfect supplement to our lesson on star formation, types of stars, and the types of life on those planets. The thing about a planet that's revolving around the red star is because the red star is not strong enough to emit light to the farthest reaches of its system. A planet that has life should be very close to the star, so close in fact that it is tidally locked, which means that only one side of its surface is facing the sun, or the star, I mean, at all times. It never turns around on its axis. So one side is perpetually daytime or light, the other side is perpetually nighttime, and they got that. They also got the thing about water, of course, being a primary signature of life. The episode didn't quite go into the possibility of water being substituted by other liquid substances, liquid mixtures or compounds that can support life, like liquid methane and ammonia. They were quite purist in that sense, wherein they said water is absolutely essential. I don't completely agree with that, although based on Earth biology, of course, we say that it is. However, what they did say sounds just about right, which is that no matter how harsh this planet is, there should be water for there to be life, and most likely the water would be in that twilight zone. which is just right between the perpetually lit side and the perpetually dark side. And the creatures that they created here, the Pentapods, are very, very interesting. They're hermaphroditic, which makes sense for a very simple type of organism in a simple type of environment. I don't think it has its own predators except for when its own prey mob it, and mobbing is actually a very interesting example of a true prey defense, especially among birds. Smaller birds would mob a large predatory bird that's trying to eat one of them. So that's something interesting to see. And the fact that it doesn't have a larger predator than itself and it doesn't have a lot of prey makes sense because there's not too much energy going around. Also, it's a nice nod to see, although they didn't mention it, they didn't say anything about it in the video, I believe, in the episode. The plants were very dark colored. I believe they were black and purple or something like that. And that makes sense because they're trying to absorb as much of the little light as possible. And so these pentapods are walking around on these 5 legs and getting things with their tentacles. And they have this mouth on their dorsal surface, which is an interesting thing to see. Not many animals have something like that. Off the top of my head, I can think of the sea lily, the crinoids, which are a type of echinoderm, as one example of an animal that has a mouth on top of its or on its dorsal surface. But that's a marine animal. That's an aquatic animal. This one is a terrestrial animal-like organism. One of the most interesting things about the pentapod is that it is able to mimic some of the behaviors of its prey. It was mentioned that they have prey that are somewhat like bacteria-like, that have quorum sensing of some sort, which wherein they communicate to each other through bioluminescence, the way fireflies do, and the way certain bioluminescent bacteria on the surface of the water do, again through quorum sensing. And it was said in the episode that the pentapods are able to mimic the jumping motion of these microorganisms and their lights, so that the organisms would be drawn away from the lights, and thus they will be easy picking for the pentapod. Now, one of the I believe this episode was much more biologically sound than the first one, although I wanted them, or I would have hoped that they would mention the thermal gradient that would be naturally found between the perpetually lit side and the perpetually dark side, or to be more accurate in this particular context, the perpetually hot side and the perpetually cold side. The perfect opportunity for them to say that was when they said that the pentapods produce offspring which they release through that common opening that they have for everything, for feeding, for sex, and for release of waste materials and gametes and larvae or whatever, which is taking the cloaca design even further, because here they don't have a separate anus from a mouth, so it's mouth plus cloaca. Anyway, when the young are released through the super cloaca, they are brought up into the sky and then swept by wind. The video says that they are swept by the wind in both directions, toward the sunlit side and the dark side, which explains why pentapods are found in both areas. But you see there allopatric speciation beginning to happen because they're very different. And presumably they won't meet anymore, even in the middle, except probably for some in the hybrid zone, which would suggest, well, those that are in the hybrid zone would probably be seeing some peripatric speciation instead. So there, I was hoping that they would mention that because of the thermal gradient, it is more likely that the wind, the warm wind, the hot wind, would be moving toward the cold side from the hot side, thus bringing warmth and melting the ice on the dark side. I've seen that a lot of biologists speculate that as opposed to our natural tendency to imagine it, the cold dark side of a planet revolving around the red dwarf wouldn't always have frozen water. Again, because of that hot wind being brought by thermal gradients from the hot side to the cold side. But they didn't mention that, and I believe that was a missed opportunity, because that would have enriched the ecology and the biology of the planet. Having said all of that, it's still a great series, a very informative one and a very interesting one. Again, for those that aren't really hardcore into science fiction, they probably wouldn't mind the extra scenes on Earth science. And so I can see why a lot of people are liking it. And so I am still looking forward to watching episodes 3 and 4, especially because I think that they're going to be more interesting. They're going to discuss binary star systems, mycelial networks of fungi, and space exploration, which is probably the best thing to end with on a series like this. Before I proceed any further, I'd like to say that I'm also quite proud that I was able to guess who the narrator was. Just a few minutes after hearing her voice, I immediately guessed, oh, that sounds like Sophie Okonedo. That rich, deep enunciation of words in that with that English accent, or that British accent, I should say. I knew that was Sophie Okonedo, and when I checked, yes, it was. So, yay, I still have it. Still able to guess voices. So if you liked what you just saw and heard, and would like to see more about popular culture in science and science fiction, don't forget to subscribe to PopScicle so that you may be alerted to new content. See you again next time.